Hey everybody, how are you today? Happy Wednesday. So today we're going to be talking about really the last part of Chapter 7, Section 1. So we're going to be continuing to talk about new imperialism, right, which is this race for colonies as Europe became obsessed with trying to take over, countries in Africa and Asia, which did not have the technology to fight back. And they wanted to conquer them, remember we said last time, for political reasons, to gain land, to gain power, to gain prestige and world respect. For economic reasons, because as you create an empire, you can steal the nation's resources, force them to be your slaves, and get free labor. Get them to buy the products you're creating as part of the Second Industrial Revolution, so you have new customers. And in terms of the social reason, some of it was, some people really believed in social Darwinism, which was kind of an excuse, right? A justification as to how people could sleep at night and be okay with the fact that they were coming in, conquering people, killing them, destroying their land, their way of life. But they were justifying it by saying, well, that's evolution. That's Darwinism, right? That's survival of the fittest. Some people make it, some people don't. So we pick up today by talking about the next justification. Looks like the word justification there is off the screen a little bit, but the next justification or excuse as to why it's okay to conquer another group of people is white man's burden. In 1899, a British man by the name of Rudyard Kipling, you may have heard of him before because he's also the author of The Jungle Book, he wrote this very famous long poem. And we're just going to look at the first stanza, and this is actually also your homework assignment that's due for Friday. So he says, and I'll kind of read the beginning first, says, some Europeans believed that it was their duty to take over uncivilized people, to help them modernize and become more advanced. They saw imperialism as a humanitarian mission. So there were good people out there who were, good Christian missionaries who wanted to, help teach others about Christianity, to change their religious beliefs, to, gain access to heaven, that kind of mentality. But there were other people, unfortunately, who use religion as an excuse and say, oh, look, you're uncivilized, you're a barbarian because you don't believe in God, or you believe in multiple gods. You're clearly uncivilized because you don't have medicine or technology like we do. So we're actually doing you a favor by conquering you. And they try to claim that they're on this humanitarian mission, but in reality, we know that's not what this is about. This is really about economic and political motivations. There are a few people who are missionaries and doctors who are out there trying to help others, but we're not really and truly spreading democracy or anything like that. We're more focused on social Darwinism, and also perhaps trying to expand to other territories because, we're just looking for a new outlet, a new place to conquer, a new place to explore, since there is no real more American frontier. So in his poem, he says, take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness, unfluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. So what he's talking about in this first stanza of this poem is he says, look, white people, you have a duty, a burden, an obligation. Send us the best that you can make, your sons, people who can go out into the wild, right? And they're calling the wild Africa, Asian nations. And you're going to go and you're going to try to get involved with these half devil, half child-like people. And they're referring to them as half devil because they're not religious or they believe in multiple gods, but they're not Christian. And they're clearly half children. They can't even take care of themselves, is their opinion, since they don't have technology or medicine or perhaps education or just kind of the major bustling cities that they do in the US or in Europe. And so he was a British man, but he was completely serious that he totally believed that whites were superior to other races. So definitely a racist mentality here. And it definitely coincides with social Darwinism, and thought that it was literally a duty of white people to conquer lesser people because without us, somehow they would just, all die. Now, obviously, it's just a bunch of crap. It's just an excuse to colonize, to conquer others, but people totally buy into it, and they literally start to think see, we're good, we're helpful that we're going in. Oh yes, because people really want you coming in, destroying their property, enslaving them, and taking away their way of life. You can hear my sarcasm there because that's not how they feel at all. But this is something that many people convince themselves is okay. And as you can imagine, many wealthy people are pro-new imperialism. They're pro-new imperialism because if you're a robber baron, Heck yeah, you want to take over some country in Africa that can't fight back, because then you steal your resources, you enslave the people to make the product even cheaper than Americans, right? In a sweatshop mentality. Or, you get them to buy their products. If they do have wealthy people in those nations, now you've opened up a new market. Plus, it's more land, it's power. So the rich really supported this mentality. The middle class were the ones who were kind of onto it, that realized, wait, maybe there's more to this than what they're saying. And the poor, for the most part, were pretty uneducated about it. And it sounded great, from the standpoint that the American government and some media outlets portrayed it like, hey, we're going to take over other countries. Well, that's good, right? Because that creates more money opportunities for the American people, which is true. But it never kind of considers the fact that these countries they're taking over are already conquered. And what you're going to be doing for homework is you're going to be analyzing some political cartoons. Because remember, if you came to the Google Meet on Monday and Tuesday, if you didn't, it happens. But please make sure you get the one for next week on Monday and Tuesday, because you're still going to get a participation grade this quarter. But we talked about how, analyzing a political cartoon is a skill. And when you look at one, the first thing to do is to try to see if there's a title. At this case, this one's called The White Man's Burden, and it was appearing in the Journal in, it looks like, Detroit. And if they have a year, you check that out. You see if there's any kind of tagline or quote. There isn't for this one. And then you kind of look at the overall message or theme. And this one is very clear that if it's about the white man's burden, imperialism, something of that nature. So it's going to be all about, the United States conquering other lands. Okay, and you get the idea that it's the United States because you can see kind of the flag here in the background. It doesn't really look like the US flag in this image, but trust me, it is. I've seen clearer pictures. I tried to find a good one, but this is not the most clear political cartoon, but it's one of the most famous ones, so we still kind of look at it. So then I mentioned that when you're analyzing a political cartoon, you really want to, after you kind of look at the overall theme, identify the characters. This is going to be hard for you to know, but this man is most likely President Teddy Roosevelt. He comes to power after President McKinley. You're going to be watching the President McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt video clips here coming up. We've only got left for your president's assignment this chapter. We've got McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt, and then Taft. So 3 more presidents, and then that assignment is due, I don't know, the 11th, the 15th. You'd have to check in classwork. And then the other person, this is supposed to be some kind of native person. Okay, it's unclear exactly if they're African or Asian, but this is like an incredibly racist image of a native person. And if you look at some of the symbols in here, yeah, this is somebody's shoes. They're trying to insinuate that this is a very dangerous area, right? And that there's someone kind of perhaps dead here along the ground. I think it says May. I'm not exactly sure there. And if you notice, so here's the American boat in the harbor. Here's some of the other ships. And it's really hard to read this part, I know, but this is schoolhouse. So it's the idea here that literally Teddy Roosevelt, the American president, and it even says U.S. there on his, I don't know if that's his water canteen there across his gun, but he is literally dragging this quote-unquote savage, because it is the white man's burden, off to the schoolhouse. And you can see it's clearly a dangerous place to live because there's just like dead people hanging out everywhere. So this cartoon, after you kind of, break it down into different sections, try to look at the expressions on people's faces, look for different symbols, imagery, words, you have to figure out what is the overall message of the cartoonist and what are they trying to say? Because remember, cartoons are satire. They're commenting on some kind of event that was happening at that time in their lives. It's the memes of the olden days. And this one is definitely a pro-imperialism kind of cartoon. The one I showed you yesterday in the Google Meet or Monday was anti. This is pro. I mean, they're basically saying that, look, these people are savages and they're going to die because it's such a dangerous place to live, wherever this is at. And, with the help of the American people, we're going to get them an education. We're going to, bring them upward towards civilization and a better life. So yet again, this is the mentality that, we know what's best for them. So this is truly embracing that white man's burden idea. So this racist mentality was not just, discussed in England, where Kipling first talked about it. It was totally believed in the US, and people thought that it was okay to conquer others because we were helping them. There were people who legit believed in that, or at least told themselves that was true, so they could profit off of it. So this one is for imperialism. Now, here's another one, we've got the white man's burden yet again. And if you notice, it's Uncle Sam, right? And he is being carried by some kind of native person. And then you've got the leader of the British, okay? And it's unclear exactly who the United States is being carried by, of what country that's supposed to represent. I would assume that when it looks at Great Britain, the next man kind of in this, line of people is clearly England. Remember, we talked about this the other day. You can always tell it's England because he's got the top hat. And he's being carried probably by someone from India because the British did own India as one of its colonies. And then you see others, and they're all being carried by people from territories that they've conquered. So in this picture, as I said, I'm not sure if that person's supposed to be from Puerto Rico or Guam or Cuba or the Philippines exactly. Or it could even be Hawaii for that matter. So Uncle Sam, though, he is basically too lazy to walk, and so are the British, and so are these other countries. And yet again, we are, of course, profiting and surviving off of these people. So this one, as you kind of look at it and you see this one was 1899, the white man's burden. It doesn't have any other real symbols or words to kind of break down. You can kind of just look at their images on their faces. But when you think about the overall message, this one I'm hoping you're starting to realize this cartoonist is against imperialism. Because there's nothing that's helping the people in this way. It's showing them as regular men. They're not drawn as savages. It's not ridiculously racist in their views or anything like this. But this one, who's benefiting off of this situation? It's America. It's the British. It's these European powers, as you look into Germany and such. They're benefiting off of the hard work, the labor of someone else. So this is supposedly the white man's burden, huh? Well, it looks like it's the native people's burdens in all reality. So this cartoonist was trying to get the message across that the white man's burden is a crock, and it's not really helping the native peoples by any means. If anything, it's helping the Americans and the Europeans. So there's definitely two different viewpoints out there. It was not, really supported in middle classes, though, or I should say in the upper classes. It was more so the middle class that would maybe support both viewpoints. But still, the U.S. government and many members of the media were for imperialism, so it's not going to be very popular to express the anti-imperialism viewpoint, yet there are going to be cartoonists and artists out there and media outlets that do kind of show their true thoughts. For the most part, many Americans, many Europeans buy into new imperialism because the government, as well as robber barons, who are basically in cahoots with the government, right? Because we've seen some government corruption being cleaned up during this progressive era of imperialism, but there's still a lot of corruption going on. And so whether it's a robber baron or the government, a lot of propaganda, meaning like posters, come out, which are advertising campaigns, and they try to get people on board with imperialism, focusing on, hey, look, it's going to give us more land, which, means we can build more factories, we can create more jobs. If you have unemployment here in the US or in a European nation, you can go to that colony, you can get a job, you can start over, you could become rich. You could even have those people be your slaves. And so, yeah, it's a crock, obviously, because, if America is truly a nation which is all about equality and, treating people fairly, yet we're being very hypocritical here as we're willing to conquer others. So when we're talking about this propaganda campaign, it really embraces this thought process, what's just called jingoism. And jingoism is about aggressive nationalism, being willing to use violence and force to conquer others because you have this racist ideology or belief system where you think you're better than them and it's okay to take over them. And this picture, if you notice, this one is from Britain, and it says jungles today are gold mines tomorrow, and it says tropical African colonies in account with the home country, and it says goods we sold, goods we received. So yet again, it's trying to focus on the fact that colonies are fantastic because you get basically stuff at cheap prices, plus they're willing to buy your product. So it's making you money, and it's really going to get many people to see, ooh, look, see, this is a good thing. But that's just kind of, a surface mentality. You have to really think about what's going on here. You can't just ever accept the facts as they're presented. So as far as imperialism went, as I said before, we're going to see the upper classes for the most part really on board with imperialism because they're the wealthy and this is just a way to get them richer. Many of the lower classes, they don't really have an education. Not all Americans are literate at this point. Many people don't go to school. Kids are, of course, child laborers. Many people don't read the newspaper even. There's no way to really get other news. We're first seeing the radio coming out, and people don't even have the money yet to buy them. So they're just kind of accepting what they're told. They're not really kind of researching anything or gathering their own opinions. So they just accept being a common laborer without an education that, yeah, imperialism is good for us. And they're not really thinking about the after effects. It's more so that middle class, as I've been saying, which realizes perhaps there's more to the story. And many of the middle class still support it because perhaps they're going to profit off of it. But people of all social classes, if they're very religious, if they're missionaries, if they're doctors, they may realize this is a problem. Now, in terms of, why are these, efforts at colonization so successful? Why is it possible for the European nations and the Americans to conquer people in Africa and people in Asia so easily? It's because when it comes to these, African and Asian peoples, they already, many of them had problems in their government. For example, the Chinese were in decline. We had talked about this in class back in the last unit when we were talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and I think I talked about it in lecture as well, how many Chinese people going back to the 1830s had been interested in coming to the United States and getting out of China because the government there was in chaos. And then they had fought an opium war with the British where many people were on drugs. And so China was struggling with a lot of problems, and people felt like the government was corrupt and the dynasty system that had existed for 3,000 years was out of date, where they had one family take power after another. So, and the Ottoman Empire is also an old, falling apart empire. So in some of these cases, it's going to be easy to take over the people because they can't fight back. There's internal squabbling over the slave trade and mistrust there between families and groups, and really just about technology that they couldn't fight back. So the advantages of the Western nations, meaning the US as well as the European countries, particularly the British, the Germans, the French, the Dutch, the Portuguese, their governments are stable. They're well organized. They have excellent armies. The British have the best navy in the world at this point. And it's all about superior technology and really medicine so that we're able to come into these countries now. And as they're coming out with more medical advances, there's no fear that you're going to acquire what the people already have there that you don't have an immunity to, because you have the medicine now to fight back and you have the technology to kill them. And they simply can't protect themselves because they're fighting with bows and arrows. And, you're fighting with the new Maxim machine gun. As the Maxim machine gun comes out, it's a machine gun. I don't think I need to explain a whole lot about that. I think you understand the concept that it's just going to cause mass casualties, as opposed to a pistol or a rifle or any kind of black powder guns from the past. We're talking about being able to kill many more people than in the past. And so it's really not going to make it realistic for many of these Asian or African peoples to resist or fight back. They can attempt to, but they're going to see massive casualties, and they're going to realize that resisting is futile. And so they get conquered, and then once they get conquered, they really have a choice to make. Do you try to assimilate if you've been conquered? Do you try to become part of, the British population? Or do you maintain your own traditions? If we take a look at people like in India, the British conquer them, they don't really assimilate. Many of them learn to speak English, and the upper class people of India choose to send their children back to England to get an education. It's good basically to know about who has conquered you so that you can fight back and understand their ways and values and traditions and kind of be considered one of them, even though you're truly not. But the vast majority of people in India had no desire in becoming members of the Anglican Church, which is a type of Protestantism in terms of Christianity. They kept their Hindu traditions. They kept their Muslim traditions. So they weren't going to change their religious beliefs or values or ways of doing things. So, they were going to perhaps try to fight back non-violently at times with passive aggressive kind of resistance. Perhaps if they were forced to be slaves in people's homes, they would spit in their food and such. Or if they were forced to, not basically forced, but the only job opportunities available would be to work for the British, they would purposely do a poor job or work really slow, and not kind of fulfill what they're supposed to be doing. And other times, of course, they would attempt to, have resistance movements and fight back violently, but they knew that there was only so much damage they could do at a time, and that they really were never going to be able to at least take back their country until they had access to those weapons. So there was always constant attempts, for nationalism to expel the imperialists, to get rid of them, to retake their home country. But without, enough technology to fight back, it's going to be very difficult. Plus, it was hard to communicate with the population as a whole to plan an uprising. Because in reality, yeah, there's way more Indian people in India than there are British. When the French take over Vietnam, yes, there's more people in Vietnam who are Vietnamese than French. But you still would have to organize some kind of massive resistance movement and get the word out of what you were doing, which is hard when you have an uneducated population and you don't have cell phones where you can send a massive text message, and you can't just put it in a newspaper because that's now being controlled by the country that has conquered you. So it's going to be a long road to try to resist. Many of these countries are not going to get their freedom until after World War II, and they're getting taken over here in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. They won't get their freedom until about 1950 or so, or some even later than that. So here's just a picture to kind of show you what I really kind of keep harping on here. On the left, what you see is this is the new Maxim machine gun, and I realize it is a huge, ridiculous gun. When you think of a machine gun of today, that's not what you're thinking. So it's not like every man had a machine gun, but they still had multiple of these. And when you see a traditional warrior, like you see the Zulu warrior there, who is willing to fight back, but they've got bows and arrows and shields, even if they know the terrain, even if they use guerrilla warfare tactics where they hide between jungle type areas, it's going to be very difficult to resist the enemy because they're just going to be able to kill so many people at once, which is how, with the use of the Maxim machine gun, the African, the Asian peoples do get conquered. And of course, this is a picture of a European doing it, but the United States does exactly the same thing in our desire to acquire the Philippines, and we'll be talking about that more next week. So as I've been mentioning, there are some people who do oppose imperialism. Specifically, in the United States, in Boston, there is something called the Anti-Imperialist League, and that's founded in 1898. By 1899, it's got about 500,000 members. And they say American expansionism is wrong. Imperialism is wrong. It's totally immoral. It's just to get rich. The U.S. government supports it because it's about power and money. The robber barons support it because it's about money. But if, many people who are members said, if you're truly Christian, this is not the Christian thing to do. We're going in and we're conquering innocent people. And as we get next week into the Spanish-American War, and actually we'll start even talking about Hawaii on tomorrow's lecture, Thursday, Fridays, you'll see that the United States was not innocent here. And I love America, but we did not do things that were necessarily the nicest to other countries. Even as we take over Hawaii, we basically are forcing our rule on others. So we claim that we're all about democracy and equality and helping others, and that we're just doing this for white man's burden, but we're not. It's really more of a social Darwinist mentality for land, money, and power. And of course, yeah, it does, help people to kind of continue that American spirit that we're going to conquer something else, since there is no more frontier here in the U.S. Now, as we conquer other countries, whether we're talking about the United States or the British, the French, any other European country, you have to decide how you're going to rule over these people. The French, for the most part, they like to rule over the people directly. So I mentioned Vietnam before. France takes over the Vietnamese here in the late 1800s, I think it's the 1880s, and they rule over the Vietnamese people all the way until after World War II. And this is what actually leads us to the Vietnam War, because the people want their freedom from French, and then they get their freedom, but then there's a fight for who's going to have power in that country, and then are they going to be communist or not, and then we eventually get involved into that conflict. The French, though, they believe in a true type colony situation where they actually send French administrators and people to Vietnam so they can teach the Vietnamese people how to speak French, what the French cuisine is like, what the French traditions are, what their values are. And so they can watch people in their colonies so that they can enslave them or hire them, get them to buy products, oversee them as they get resources and just, generally tell them what to do. Now, this is an expensive, way of doing things because you need to have a huge army presence there to make sure that people don't rebel and kill, right, your, colonists who have moved there. So it's expensive, you need a large military presence, but if you're looking for a place to ease population pressures so that French people could really and truly leave France and go colonize and live somewhere else and start over, this would be the way to do it. And of course, the local people are not going to like that you're telling them what to do and sending in government officials and such. Now, the British chose to rule more what we call indirectly, where they leave the local rulers in charge, and the local rulers can kind of do as they please. And they say, look, this is what they did in England, or I should say in India at least. They said, all right, you guys are the princes. And India was never truly a united country. There were different princes who kind of ruled kind of each region. And they said, you guys can stay in power, but you still have to realize that you have to report to the British government into king and crown and country and such. And so it gave the local leaders a lot of authority, and there were still military troops stationed in India. There were still skirmishes and conflicts that happened between the British that were stationed there and some of the wealthy British people who moved to India just to explore and see the world and such. But by doing it and not having like a ton of British people move to India and not having a huge military presence, sometimes the thought is that it'll be cheaper, which it is because you don't have to have such a huge military, but also maybe the people won't rebel as much because they feel like they're still in control of their country. That was only somewhat true. There would be constant rebellions that still came out of it. But this is an indirect way of ruling. And the goal was yet again to eventually, over time, to westernize those princes. And it was very common. Most of the Indian or aristocracy, so to speak, these princes would send their sons back to England, to like Oxford and Cambridge to go to school. And so that way they could, eventually run India. And the thought was, in time, the British were very, egotistical, believed in white man's burden, thought they were helping the Indian people, and they were civilizing them slowly over time, dragging them off to school. So if you rule indirectly, the way that the British did, this is what we call a protectorate, where you're leaving the local rulers in place, but there would still be members of the British government who would tell the Indian princes what to do if necessary, and there would still be a military presence in that country. And as I said, it's a lot less costly. The United States is going to be doing this as well. We actually end up doing this with Cuba. So it's never that we truly own Cuba, but it is one of our protectorates. It's one of the territories that we do control. And we're going to control them for many, many years. And then, of course, that will eventually end. And then Cuba will be on its own. And then Cuba will be communist. And then there'll be many years where we don't have a relationship with Cuba at all. Last thing to mention for today, I believe, is that our last slide? Yep, last thing to mention for today is that besides kind of ruling over a country directly, where you make a colony, or indirectly, where you make a protectorate, you could create something called a sphere of influence, which was one of our vocab terms. And a sphere of influence basically says that you're going to tell a country who they can trade with and who they are allowed to invest with. And so many of these countries, for example, the British, yet again, because they were considered the most powerful country in the world at this point in time. It was not the United States. They had the biggest army. They had the biggest navy. They had the biggest empire. They owned land all over the world. If you're thinking about Australia and New Zealand and India, and their power was kind of unmatched at this time. And then, of course, they constantly lose land, gain more land. But they were very interested in gaining a sphere of influence in Asia, meaning that they had exclusive trade rights with China, which is what they'd been doing for years as they tried to conquer the Chinese, right, through that Opium War. And they wanted to really tell, once they realized it was not going to be possible to truly conquer China, and that they couldn't make China a colony, and they couldn't really make China a protectorate, they wanted to basically control China and its resources and make China into kind of their puppet or their pet, and tell the Chinese who they could trade with and do business with. That never actually comes to pass. The United States gets involved and says, whoa, wait a minute. you're getting way too powerful here, British. Supposedly we do it out of the niceness of our heart to help the Chinese, but it's also really because we didn't like how powerful the British were getting. But it's, all about trying to tell people who they can trade with, who they can buy and sell stuff to. And it's just another form of colonial rule as you have these exclusive trade rights. All right, guys, that wraps up things for today. Have a great day. Later.